There we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Wine. I am blown away that we are in season 3 and up to the letter V. And yes, we are here talking about Vaccarèse. I think I said that correctly. And this is, if we're going to talk about this grape, we have the perfect person here to give us all of the information. So we have Jason Haas of Tablas Creek with us today. And for those of you who do not know who I am Lori Budd. My husband and I own Dracaena Wines, in tasting room is in downtown Paso. And on the other side, I'm exploring the wine glass, WSET Level 2, Spanish wine scholar, champagne specialist, Côte de Rhône specialist, and just all around Jason fan. But before we get to Jason, I'm going to introduce my co-host, Deb.
Hi, I'm Debbie Giaquindo. I'm known as the Hudson Valley Wine Goddess. I am a certified specialist of wine, a wine location specialist in Port and Champagne, and a certified sherry wine specialist. I'm author of the book, Tapping the Hudson Valley, Day Trips and Weekend Itineraries to Visit the Hudson Valley Wine Region. I'm chairperson for the Hudson Valley Wine, Spirits, and Cider Competition, and I'm partner in a restaurant in North Wildwood, New Jersey called Trio North Wildwood. I think that's probably it, but and Jason.
I'm not certified anything. I'm Jason Haas. I'm second generation proprietor and general manager here at Tablas Creek Vineyard in Paso Robles, California. And we are one of the pioneers of the California Rhône movement, and I've gotten to have a front row seat to a lot of the real explosion of interest and complexity that we've seen in the Rhône movement. And I'm super excited that we're talking about one of my favorite new grapes today.
Yay! Yes. So we're going to go to Elmo. Deb, you're going to handle him?
Okay, I will handle him. Yes.
I'm going to raise my glass of Vaccarèse.
I got to figure out now, share screen. Here we go. Okay.
See, it's cute. It'd be even cuter if you actually could hear Elmo.
I know. Walking. I'm still working on trying to figure that out. Because they changed the platform, or YouTube won't let them share it or import it, or one of those
technology. But we are here to talk about Vaccarèse, right? Is that the correct way to say it? The last D does not.
It's close. I think Vaccarèse. It's a little bit of it's a harder Z sound, and it's an ez at the end because there's a little accent grave over not the last E, but the one before. It looks like an Italian word, and it's not. It's French. It's named after a village called Vaccarèse in the southern Rhône.
All right, I can put my little Spanish Juarez. I can do that.
Vaccarèse. I think I can do that. I think I can do this word.
Well, I saved it for my first sip, and I did take a sip while we were watching Elmo. And the first thing that comes to my nose is like a licorice-y type of palate or aromatics. And this is my first time sipping it, and it's beautiful. Oh, I love trying new grapes.
I mean, you are far from alone. It is one of the rarest grapes in the world. I mean, I know when we bottled our first vintage, we got our first vintage of Vaccarèse into production in 2019 and decided to bottle it on its own, really because nobody knew what it was. We think it was the first 100% Vaccarèse made anywhere in the world in at least 50 years. It's really genuinely rare.
Wow. Yay.
I've got so many questions.
Yeah, we do.
It's just so cool. I just love geeking out on new grapes.
Yeah.
And I don't want to say it's new old grapes, but grapes that are not mainstream, that people don't know about, that I can say, you got to try this.
Right.
You know?
I mean, there's kind of a cool history to Vaccarèse. It was apparently pretty widely planted around the south of France in the first half of the 19th century. But there were a bunch of grapes that were popular then that fell out of favor because they were susceptible to powdery mildew. And there was a powdery mildew outbreak that hit around 1850 in France. And so they didn't really have a solution for this, a chemical solution or a viticultural solution to it. So a lot of those grapes just were getting pulled out and replaced by grapes that were easier at the point when phylloxera hit in the 1870s. And that was like an extinction event. So anything that was not really popular, anything that was not something that people were trying to make a point to cultivate, like there was a decent chance it just disappeared. And when Jacques Perrin, the patriarch of our French partners at Château de Beaucastel, when he decided in the 1950s to go and try to find all of the traditional Châteauneuf-du-Pape grapes that were in the old lists from 100 years previously, there's only one vineyard that he could find Vaccarèse in. So he brought it back, he planted it at the vineyards at Beaucastel, and he thought it was worth exploring. It never became a major thing for them, but he did sell cuttings to a handful of other, or I don't even know if he sold them, maybe just shared cuttings with a handful of other vineyards in the south of France. And when we brought it into the country, there were about 30 acres of it planted in the entire world. That meant like 10 of those acres were in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. About 20 of those acres were in the Gard, which is a neighboring region just to the east of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And in both cases, it's a super trace variety that's valued for its dark color and its kind of dark spices, dark sweet spices like that licorice that you mentioned, Lori. And I don't think we had much of a roadmap when we started growing it. We thought it would be cool to try and we'd see what we got.
Well, you did mention your relationship with Beaucastel, but can you elaborate a little bit about that? Because you have quite the story of how you settled in Paso and created Tablas Creek. So how did that family relationship begin, and how do we end up in Paso?
Sure. So my dad was an importer. He was an American importer of mostly French wines all the way back into the 1950s. He made his name importing wines from Burgundy and Bordeaux. He was the exclusive American importer for Chateau Lafite and Chateau Petrus in the 60s and early 70s. But he decided pretty early on that the future of wine importing was not carving up Burgundy and Bordeaux finer and finer, but instead finding other regions that he thought were making great wines and offered good value. And he would try to find a producer in those regions whose wines he could use to introduce the whole region into the US market. So he did this in a bunch of places. He did this in Alsace with Domaine Weinbach. He did this in Rioja with Marcus de Caceres. And he did this in the Rhône with Château de Beaucastel. He managed to go to Châteauneuf-du-Pape in the mid-1960s and ended up in the cellars of Jacques Perrin at Beaucastel and managed to convince Jacques not just to appoint him their American agent, but also to agree to lend him his two sons to travel around the US with my dad and introduce Americans not just to Beaucastel, but Châteauneuf-du-Pape and the Rhône Valley more generally. And through all of those trips, they became friends. So my dad would make, 5 or 6 trips a year to different parts of the US with Jean-Pierre and François Perrin, Jacques' two sons. And every time they were in California, they would take an extra day or two and explore some of the new vineyards that were sprouting up here in California. And by the late 70s, my dad and particularly Jean-Pierre Perrin were convinced that California had the potential to make really great wines, really world-class wines. And yet they were kind of baffled as to why, in what they thought was clearly a Mediterranean climate, they didn't see anybody focusing on the grape varieties that they knew and loved from Beaucastel. So they thought that those grapes from the Southern Rhône, from the Mediterranean part of France, would do really well in California. And yet that wasn't where people were mostly going. People were planting Cabernet and Chardonnay and Merlot and Pinot Noir, things from Burgundy and Bordeaux, and not Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, Roussanne, Marsanne, Viognier. So in 85, they put together a partnership with the two families as equal partners and started looking for land. Took them 4 years to decide on the right spot. But in 89, we bought a 120-acre former alfalfa farm and cattle ranch here in the hills west of Paso Robles, because it turned out that Paso was the best fit in terms of like highly calcareous soils, long growing season with enough heat, but cold nights, and then enough rainfall to dry farm. It was really the only place in California where they could find all three of those things that they were looking. And so that was where we founded Tablas Creek. And then we started by looking around at what was available for Rhône varieties in California. Didn't love what we found. I mean, there were a few grape varieties here. There was Syrah here. There was Grenache. There was Viognier. There was Marsanne. But a lot of the more trace varieties just didn't exist here. And there were real questions about the quality of the clonal material of things like Mourvèdre, Grenache, and Roussanne. So we decided to take new cuttings of all the principal varieties from Beaucastel and bring them into the United States. We waited 3 years for them to clear a U.S. government-mandated quarantine, and then built our own grapevine nursery to propagate and eventually sell these varieties to other people. Started with the main ones and have continued to bring in the more obscure Chateauneuf varieties little by little over the decades. So Vaccarèse was one of the last to make its way from France through the USDA quarantine system to Tablas Creek.
That simple system of quarantine.
Well, now you basically grew up in the wine industry. Was there any point in time where you thought you wanted to go on a different direction, like where it wasn't going to be, I'm going to one day take over the family business. I really want to be a surgeon or, something completely different? So
this part of Tablas Creek didn't get started until I was in high school. So this really wasn't a part of my growing up. What I saw was the import business. And I spent several summers working at vineyards in France. If you have a dad who's a wine importer and you don't get yourself a summer job, you tend to get sent to a vineyard to work. And it turned out I really enjoyed that piece of it a lot more than what I saw my dad doing, which was buying and selling other people's wines. So I didn't really, as I was growing up, I didn't see myself in the import side of things. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I didn't see that. And I also, once I decided that maybe the production side of things would be fascinating to be a part of, I didn't want to take a path straight into a family business right out of school, because I didn't feel like I would have come with enough life experience, enough confidence in my own decisions. So I have a master's degree in archaeology. I taught for a while. I worked in tech for 4 years. I lived and worked in DC during the kind of height of the tech bubble, teaching internet programming languages. So I've done some other stuff. I did some other stuff until I was about 30, and then kind of came back and rejoined the family.
So you went, you got a taste of different things, enjoyed yourself, and came back.
Came home.
Yeah, I think it's so important. It's something that the parents, our French partners, that they do very consciously. They require that the next generation of kids go out and do something else, go out and get some life experience, and then essentially apply to rejoin the family. And they have to go and justify what they're going to bring to the family in front of all of their siblings and cousins and uncles. And, it's pretty intense, it sounds like. But I think you don't want people to feel like they're somehow given this or obligated to do this. I think it only really works. A multi-generational family business only really works when it's the choice of the next generation to do it, and they feel like they need to contribute. It's not a given. It's not a birthright thing.
And that is true. You see it across the board, especially in France and in Spain. The children they can't come back to the winery until they've done something else. Yeah.
And rightfully so. I mean, I think that's good. Yeah. Because otherwise, I think that if you go right into the family business, what did I miss? I really don't want to do that. I want I want to be a chef, or I want to be a, school teacher or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you and Tablas Creek as a whole are, such an important part of Paso Robles culture. So first, thank you for everything that you do for Paso, and just your openness to share everything, which I think, again, is part of the Paso vibe is, share, that rising tide raises all ships things. But why do you feel it's so important? Because it must be important to you because you're doing it all the time. Why do you feel it's so important to be that ambassador?
I think that I have two ways that I usually answer this question. One is that I feel like wine is fundamentally not a zero-sum kind of product. So it's different than buying a car, where like if you buy a Volkswagen, you're not also buying a Honda. It's a one or the other thing. With wine, nobody drinks just one wine. And if somebody buys a bottle of a neighbor's Cabernet, that doesn't make them less likely to buy a bottle of Tablas Creek. I feel like it makes them more likely to buy a bottle of Tablas Creek. Mm-hmm. If somebody buys a bottle of Syrah that's made in Santa Ynez, same thing. It doesn't make them less likely, it makes them more likely. And if somebody buys a wine that's regeneratively farmed from the Loire, again, that doesn't make them less likely, it makes them more likely. So what we try to do is find kind of the groups that we're a part of, and then try to make sure that those groups are as healthy as possible, that like best practices are shared, that we can communicate what we think is great about the place that we're in, or the grapes that we grow, or the way that we farm. So I feel like it's not contradictory, like running as good a business as we can and supporting the community. I feel like they really support each other. The other way that I usually answer this question is that we learned pretty early on that what we were making was pretty obscure. Like we were making blends that didn't really have a category on the marketplace 25 years ago, from grapes that people didn't know and couldn't pronounce in a part of California they hadn't heard of, with French names that didn't mean anything to them. So like we set ourselves a pretty serious mountain to climb, and realized that if we couldn't get people inside of our world, that was going to be a really heavy lift. So from very early on, we've always tried to kind of market through education, and bring people behind the curtain and share what we're doing and why. It started out with email and a paper newsletter that we would send out every quarter. We started a blog in 2007, which turned out to be really valuable, much more so than I originally had ever imagined it would be. And then, of course, it got easier with social media when that came in a few years later. So, I mean, our tools are better, but the idea has been pretty consistent from the beginning, where like we try to talk about what we're doing and why, because we feel like that's the best possible way to make real connections with people.
Excellent.
Yeah. Now Tablas Creek is located in Paso. I was out in Paso. Oh, I can't remember. It's been a while, like 2006, somewhere between 2006 and 2010. I can't remember. Had a great time. Loved it. Spent 10 days out there. And I actually asked this question when I was out there. What is the difference between the east side and the west side?
So there are many differences. And there are some differences that are like truly east side, west side differences. There are other differences that are more north, south differences. And there are others that run kind of diagonally through the appellation. So the biggest differences when you're talking east and west is that the west is closer to the ocean and gets more rain. And that's the one really fundamental thing that the west side of Paso gets that the east does not. It also tends to be a little more mountainous. If you look at the topography, you have the Santa Lucia mountain range that runs through the western part of Paso Robles. The east side of Paso is more the alluvial fan of rivers like the Estrella River and the Huehuero. So it tends to be sandier and more sort of rolling hills east of town, and more mountainous and more limestoney, so old seabed that got pushed up in the creation of these mountains west of town. What it is not particularly is cooler west of town than it is east of town. A lot of people assume that that's the main difference, and that's not really true. It's coolest in the south because that's where the passes are that come through the mountains, and warmest in the north. So south and west is cool and wet. North and west, kind of where we are, is middle climate and wet. South and east is cool and dry, and north and east is hot and dry. So you have this combination of climate and soils and rainfall that I don't think divides up the region as neatly as like where the river actually is. But topographically, it looks different because as you go west, it tends to be more of these canyons through these hills and eventually small mountains. And it tends to be covered in oak trees because there's enough rain to support those oak forests, whereas east of town looks like kind of rolling savanna.
And so before I ask the next question, Veronique actually said she just visited Tablas Creek with 7 wine friends, and they loved their tasting at Tablas. And the person who conducted it was wonderful, and they are now new club members.
So great. That's the way it's supposed to work. Lovely. Thank you, Veronique.
And you did mention the concept of regenerative farming and sharing what you've learned from it or whatever. But can you first explain what is regenerative farming and why it's important and what changes you've seen in the vineyard? And I'm going to intercept that with a statement before. If anybody does not follow you, Tablas Creek on Instagram or whatever, they should, because that is a true firsthand look at everything that they're doing in the vineyard. So go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Lori. So we started out farming organically. That was something that we inherited from our partners at Beaucastel, who've been fully organic since the 1950s, out of this belief that that's the best possible way to make wines that show off their terroir, show off the character of the place in which they're going. Regenerative farming takes that a step further, where you are trying to really foster soil health and biodiversity and create a vibrant ecosystem. And regenerative just indicates that instead of something that's like sustainable, where you're trying not to make your environment any worse, you're trying to sustain it. Regenerative basically means you're building back in more richness, more biodiversity, more organic matter in the soil. And there are all kinds of benefits to that, like greater water holding capacity for your soils, like cooler soil temperatures. You're trying to avoid tilling, so you're keeping a living crop on the ground, and that helps keep soil temperatures down, helps retain more moisture. We have a flock of 100 and some odd sheep, and integrate that into the vineyard. That increases both, obviously, the biological biodiversity, but also the microbial biodiversity in the soil. It helps make healthier soils, helps fertilize naturally. So the idea is that regenerative farming is this kind of intensive focus on creating a healthy ecosystem within your farm unit as much as is consistent with growing an actual crop. So there's lots of pieces that go into it. Our particular brand of regenerative farming is something called Regenerative Organic Certified, that also includes commitments to doing things like reducing our use of shared resources, like non-renewable energy and groundwater. We're 100% solar powered. We're largely dry farmed. And then it includes commitments to farm worker fairness and to animal welfare. So our flock of sheep has to be treated well. And our farm workers have to be paid a living wage and have good working conditions. And we have to invest in their education. And all these things that we think are kind of the true measure of sustainability. It's not just about your land. It's about your business and your people as well.
Perfect.
Now we are here to talk about Vaccarese, if I said it right. This is one of the easier ones that we've had. And I always like to know, like, the lineage, like their parents, where the name come from. I think you said it was a town, correct?
Yeah, I don't know that its lineage is actually even known. It's so rare that I don't think there's been a ton of research time dedicated to it. It seems to have evolved in the Rhône. It's never been identified anywhere else, though one of the really cool things is the Historic Vineyard Society that Morgan Twain Peterson from Bedrock and Tegan Pasolacqua from Turley and Sandlands and Dave Gates from Ridge that they founded, where they're doing DNA testing of historic kind of heritage California vineyards. They have found a couple of vines of Vaccarèse. So it was evidently popular enough in that like 19th century period that people bothered to take it with them when they were bringing cuttings from Europe to California. But it appears to have evolved in the Rhône. It's named after a village, and it's important, not important, but sometimes people get it confused with the appellation, which is Vaccarèse, which is Vacqueyras. That's a village. This is not named after that. It's named after another village, which is spelled Vaccares, which is this little village not far from Avignon. And this was apparently the grape from that village.
Wow.
Okay. And now, as you mentioned, it really is a relatively rare grape. And on the website, I think you said that there's only like 10 acres planted. How much does Tablas Creek have? And then kind of dive a little bit more into that fun process of bringing the vines in.
Sure. So we have about half an acre now, though we have another half acre that we have kind of laid out, identified as where we want to plant another small block. And the way that it comes into the country is essentially there are 3 stations that the U.S. Department of Agriculture licenses to do what they call the indexing. So essentially the virus testing of grapevine material. And they're all associated with research universities. So our first batch of imports we did actually with Cornell in upstate New York. But our more recent imports, the ones that we've done in the last 2 decades, have gone through UC Davis here in California. So what happens is the vines come in, they are planted in pots, then they graft what are known to vines that are called indicator vines, so vines that are known to be susceptible to a certain virus, onto the vine that you bring in. They grow it for a certain number of months. It's usually about 3 months, and check to see if that indicator vine shows signs of sickness. And if it does, they know that it's because of contact with your vine and you have that virus. If it doesn't, then they know you don't have that virus. They cut that off, graft a new indicator vine on, and check for the next virus. So the reason it takes as long as it does is that it's just a certain number of growing months of each virus that they're testing for.
That's really interesting.
And then at the end of those 2 or 3 years, you get the cuttings that you brought in, like basically the vines with all of the soil washed off of the roots, and you can then start propagating them. So you're only allowed to bring in 6 cuttings of each type. So it's not like you start with thousands, and then you need to plant those in pots and grow them and cut them into single bud sections and root those sections and grow them. And it's a process for sure.
And Karen wanted to thank you for recognizing animal and workers' welfare. That is just as important.
Yeah. And then if the vine is found to have a disease, does it get destroyed?
So you have a choice at that point. You can either pay that research university to clean it up. So they do this by a technique that's called meristem cultivation. So they take the new growth and they cut the tiny slice off of the tip of the newest growth and essentially grow it out in a petri dish until it gets large enough to plant, and then they can test it again. And the hope is that it has outgrown the virus. Like you get a slice of new growth where the virus didn't get to. There's no guarantee that works. And sometimes it takes multiple rounds of cleanup. So something like Vaccarèse took 3 rounds of cleanup before it was released to us. So we actually brought it into the country in 2003, and it wasn't released until 2014. And then we spent 2 years propagating it, got it in the ground in 2016, and got our first harvest in 2019.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
Then you have to go through the process of getting it approved by the TTB, by the federal government, before you can put it on a label. Like you can get it into the country and you can grow it, but before you can put it on a wine label, the TTB needs to recognize that it is a real grape. And added to their official list. So I think we're now 9 grapes into that petition process where we've assembled the dossier of information about it and sent it off to the federal government and waited for their thumbs up.
Wow. Not easy.
No, not easy. And I'm not even positive it's fully necessary, but at the same time, I certainly sympathize with why the quarantine process is there. We don't want to inadvertently bring in a pest or a virus that's going to wipe out our whole industry. And I guess you don't want people sort of making up grape varieties, pretending that they have something that they don't. I don't know. So,
right. Something that they're saying is
like
different
than alcohol. It is more regulated than you think it probably should be.
Yeah, it's probably a checks and balances too.
Yeah.
So,
but go ahead, Deb.
Anyway, no. Go ahead.
You're up to 8.
I'm up to 8. Oh, we got so caught up with the vines. The Rhône Valley. I mean, it's. Can you talk about where it is and how it's divided? Like Paso is east to west, and they are north versus south.
Yeah, so the Rhône Valley, it's basically the valley on either side of the Rhône River, which flows out of Lake Geneva in western Switzerland, and basically flows more or less west until it hits the city of Lyon, and then turns south and flows south into the Mediterranean. And people think of it as this uniform region because it's called the Rhône. It's the same river, but really it's 2 separate regions. There's the southern Rhône, where grapes that originated in Spain, like Grenache and Mourvedre and Grenache Blanc, are kind of king. And then as you go further north and you get to a more continental climate up in the northern Rhône, then you have grapes that evolved there. So Syrah, Viognier, Marsanne that are king. And there's a certain amount of mixing. Yes, you can find some Grenache in the northern Rhône. You find some Syrah and some Viognier in the southern Rhône. But it's this roughly 200-mile long stretch, which is fairly far. And if you think of where the northern Rhône is, it is as close to Burgundy as it is to the southern Rhône. So in terms of climate, it's quite different. In terms of cuisine, it's quite different. You get up to Lyon, they're cooking with butter, and you get down to Avignon, it's all olive oil. So there's this region that's shared by a certain amount of overlap in grape varieties and a certain amount of overlap in culture, but is, I think, more properly thought of as 2 separate parts.
And there's somewhat of a controversy as to how many grapes are allowed in the Rhône Valley. So like, what's the number? What's the controversy? And do you see this changing, kind of how Bordeaux has now allowed more grapes because of climate change? Do you see something like that occurring in the Rhône?
Yeah, I think a controversy is probably overstating it. Historically, people talked about there being 13 grapes allowed in Châteauneuf-du-Pape and 22 grapes allowed in Côtes-du-Rhône. And that includes a pretty diverse collection of grapes that evolved in Spain, grapes that evolved in the south of France, grapes that evolved in kind of the middle of France. And more recently, they have tried to add specificity to these lists by adding all of the color variants. So, like, for example, if you look at that list of 13 grape varieties in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, it just says Grenache. It does not say Grenache Noir, Grenache Blanc, Grenache Gris. And so there is an updated list that was published maybe a decade ago that listed all of the acceptable color variants and raised that number from 13 to 18. So I didn't really change the list, and there wasn't really any controversy about it. It was just the French kind of wine governmental service trying to be precise, trying to be complete in their listing. I have not heard any buzz about them needing new grape varieties, maybe because so many of those grape varieties are from hotter, drier climates to start with. Like, you think of where a grape like Mourvedre, or Monastrell as it's called in Spain, where that comes from, it's quite a bit hotter and drier than even the southern Rhône. So I feel like the region is probably pretty well adapted to a hotter, drier future, with the exception that so much of that region is planted to Grenache, which turns out as it gets hotter to become very alcoholic. So I know talking to producers in the Rhône, they're struggling with how to harvest their Grenache with ripe flavors at less than 15% alcohol.
Right.
So I think there's going to be a greater investment in grapes like Mourvèdre and Counoise and Cinsault and some of those red grapes that ripen later and don't accumulate sugar quite as efficiently. But I don't know that they're going to need to go outside of the world of Rhône varieties to do that.
Okay. Now I think it's probably about time to taste. Since yeah. Now my wine was sent to my sisters because she couldn't send it to me down here. But I just got back last night from my trip, so I have to take a ride to New York. So I'm going to do that next week. So let's compare. Taste the wine, Lori, and give us, your tasty notes. And how does Vaccarèse compare to other Rhône varieties?
Yeah. So do you want me to talk about how we think it does, or do you want to go into this without me biasing things in any way and just talk about what you're tasting, Lori?
No. Well, you know what? Yeah, I think you're the expert on it, and you should explain it. For me though, I am loving that licorice thing that's going on, and then there's like fresh tobacco, like hasn't quite been rolled yet or getting ready to be rolled. It's just I really had no idea what to expect, but it's beautiful, and it's kind of, I don't want to go into another question because I really am bad at it, food pairing, but like it's enough to stand up to quite a bit of food products, but I also like it just sitting on its own.
Yeah, I mean, it's as a grape, most of the red grapes in the Rhône world are red fruited. So you think of Grenache, you think of Counoise, you think of Cinsault, and even of the obscure ones like Terre Noire and Muscardin, those are both red fruited grapes. Really, the main black fruited grape in the Rhône world is Syrah. Vaccarèse, but Syrah, at least in a warm climate, tends to be black fruited but low acid. And in the warmer climate, you tend not to get a lot of the kind of herby, spicy, bacony wildness that you can get from Syrah in a cooler climate.
Right.
One of the reasons why most of Châteauneuf du Pape does not dedicate a ton of their vineyard to Syrah, because it tends to be just this kind of like massive, dark fruited, but kind of monolithic flavor component. Vaccarèse is black fruited but high acid. It's the only one in that like combination. There's red fruited high acid, red fruited low acid, black fruited low acid, and Vaccarèse is the only Rhône variety in that black fruited high acid category. So I think that's one of the ways in which we're finding it the most useful, is that it's a great way of adding that kind of herby spiciness that you were talking about, the licorice, the tobacco, and to keep it dark in tone and in color. It's a relatively dark colored grape, and keep it fresh. So you've got that combination that is unlike anything else in the Rhône world. And you can see why it was useful and used a lot as a blending grape. I don't know how much, even back in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, when it was a lot more widely planted, I don't know how much it was used as the lead grape. I don't know that there's any data on that. But I think it is a cool thing on its own. It reminds me maybe more almost of like a Loire Cabernet Franc than it does anything from the Rhône as a varietal bottling, because of that black fruit, spicy, little bit minty, black licoricey character.
So it's in the Rhône, and is it used as a blending grape, or is it standalone?
It's barely used at all. But yes, when it's used as a blending grape. There's actually in the GAR, it's restricted to being, I can't remember whether it's no more than 10% or no more than 15% of a blend. So it's used, but it has to be a minor component in the blend. And in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, where there's only a few acres of it planted, it just is used as a minor player in a blend because there's not enough of it to do anything else.
And you make it as a single varietal?
We use it in our Esprit de Tablas. Okay. We've used it in the Esprit blend every year since 2020. Mm-hmm. And in some years, we've had enough to also do a small amount as a varietal bottling, and in some years we haven't. Our priority is always on the Esprit. That's our flagship wine. So that gets whatever it needs. And in 2021, we used every drop of Vaccarèse that the vineyard produced in the Esprit blend. In 2022, which is the one that Laurie's tasting and the one that we sent you, we had enough Vaccarèse and the blend worked out so that we were able to use some of it in the Esprit Red and still have some to bottle on it.
Okay.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
So in the vineyard itself, does it need to be concerned with any pests? Is there a specific soil type or vineyard conditions that Vaccarèse prefers? And you said you did a new plot, so why choose that plot?
So it does appear to be susceptible to mildew. That was the reason why it became rare in France. And we don't have a lot of mildew pressures here in Paso Robles, but like the times where we have seen some mildew pressures, like in 2023, it has shown up first in the Vaccarèse, which is interesting. I don't know that dictates any particular place to plant it, but where we have it right now, the block that we have right now is on this kind of calcareous ridge, so very thin topsoil, and down into this intense limestone, really within 6 inches of the surface, and that's hard for any grape variety. That's a very it's a very high struggle kind of area. So the area that we have blocked out for it is more towards a valley bottom, and it's a little bit deeper soils. We want to see how it does given a little bit cushier life. Not because we're unhappy with what it's showing where it is, but just because there's not enough literature out there really to tell us what we're supposed to do with it. And so we're trying to experiment to gather data for ourselves.
And you're leaving the other block in, you're just adding.
Yep.
Perfect.
Oh, that's interesting. Because you're pioneers in it for,
It is. I remember it wasn't this grape. It was Terre Noire, which is a slightly less obscure grape that we also grow, that we were planting back in 2010. And I remember having a conversation with Marc Perrin, who's the oldest Perrin of my generation. Like, what should we expect from this grape? And he just paused for about 20 seconds. It was like, we blended in with everything else. You'll have to let us know. So, I mean, there are grapes that are widely enough planted in Châteauneuf and at Beaucastel that Beaucastel will vinify them on their own every year. But there are others where they have them. It's important to them that they have them, but it might only be enough to be like a third of a small tank along with two other trace varieties. So like that, they're enjoying the experiments that we're doing here on these grapes as well.
And to geek out a bit, tell us about the clusters, the leaves, the maturation. Is it early bud, late ripener, typical harvest? Your charts are infamous for knowing when to harvest and those boards and everything. So I know you know exactly when to harvest.
I mean, we think we know. I mean, it has a reputation of being ready about on the same cycle as Grenache. Okay. So that not super early, not super late, kind of in the middle for us. We felt like our first few years, we maybe picked it a little earlier than we should have. I mean, we were looking at, what did we know? We were looking at numbers. We were looking at the health of the vines. We were looking at the clusters. The clusters are large clusters of large berries with thick skins. So Grenache is large clusters, large berries, thin skins, and it tends to make a fairly pale wine. the skins of Vaccarèse, even though the berries are big, the skins are this like deep blue black, like a blueberry almost. So we usually pick it somewhere right towards the middle of the ripening cycle. The leaves are large and kind of deep green. It's a pretty vigorous grape, it looks like. We think maybe the large berries on the large clusters, it does in the same way that something like Zinfandel can be a problem in an area where there's too much humidity, and because the clusters can be pretty tight, you can end up with rot problems. And I think Vaccarèse is probably the same. It's large berries, again, tight clusters, but we haven't found any particularly insurmountable problems with it.
Yeah. The acid definitely cuts through that tannin, because I would assume that with that skin and that thickness and all that it's a very deep tannin, which I can see why it would blend in between the color and the structure that it has. But the acid is cutting through that tannin, that it's actually not drying at all. You can tell there's tannin, but it's not drying at all. It's really...
Yeah, and it has a relatively high level of tannin because it has thick skins, but it also has large berries. So a lot of the question of how tannic a wine is the ratio of skin to juice.
Right.
And this is one where, like, yes, the skins are thick, but there's also a lot of juice. So it ends up being moderately tannic, but not super tannic. It's not like a small berry, thick skin grape like Syrah or like Cabernet.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
So now that we know how it tastes and what to expect, what would you pair with it, food-wise?
Again, there's not a lot of literature out here on this. So,
what do you
use your palate? What do you eat with it? What would you eat with it?
I also don't. I don't open it all that often. We don't have that much of it. I tend to recommend that people pair it with the same things that they would normally pair Syrah with. So, particularly like a Northern Rhône Syrah, but not necessarily like an Australian Shiraz or a really ripe California Syrah, but a Northern Rhône Syrah where you've got that kind of meatiness and dark fruit and a little bit of wildness to it. So, it's famously good with lamb. It's good with braises. It's good with kind of pepper spice. So that's at least a starting point for people.
And then how do you, I don't even know, do you pour it in the tasting room? Is it club member only tasting? You don't have a lot of it, so I can't imagine it's on that menu every day. But how would you recommend serving it when it was delivered to me? It was actually chilled, but it was such a cold day outside. I don't know if it was just chilled because it was in his car or you guys keep it chilled.
I don't know that I would particularly serve it chilled. I would serve it at cellar temperature. We do pour it in the tasting room when we have it, which we never make that much of it, so it doesn't ever last that long.
Right.
So it's typically here for 2, 3, 4 months after we release it. We send a note out to our wine club members, usually give them a month of it being exclusive to them, and then make it available to anybody who wants to try it. We're still at the information gathering stage with this grape, so we want to show it to as many people as we can because it's fun for us to see what people think. So we happen to have it right now, but that's probably only going to be true for another, month or 6 weeks. Okay.
Wonderful.
And then it'll be gone right when this podcast and webinar come out.
Yeah.
We'll have another one. We're bottling the 2023 Vaccarèse in April, so it won't be super long before the next one's ready.
Good.
How was 24? So 24 was so light in so many varieties. Was it tough? And
yeah, it was light. It was particularly light in whites for us. Reds were okay. Whites surprised us. We finished overall down about 15% compared to 2023, which I've talked to lots of people who were down a lot more than that. So I'm not feeling like it was. I'm not feeling like it was a catastrophe by any stretch. Quality looks good, but yeah, we were hoping with 2 years of good rain in a row and no frost in the spring, we were actually hoping for a plentiful vintage, and it a little bit threw us. We'd gone out and done some cluster counts and estimated that our crop levels would be average to maybe slightly above average. And when it came in like 15 or 20% below average, that was a little bit of a shock. It highlighted that maybe our counting systems are not fully developed yet.
Oh no.
Always learning.
Yeah. We had, with that cold temperatures that we've had while I was out cruising the Caribbean, we had like -11, decimated the crops in the Hudson Valley. Really bad. Really bad. So
I know I was up in Washington State for Hospice du Rhône this past year in April, and they were talking about the impact of this like hard freeze that they had gotten last winter. It sounded just brutal.
Yeah. I was getting pictures -11. I'm like, oh my God. I thought first thing, like, that's not good for the grapes or anything else, fruit trees,
or people,
or pipes. A lot of frozen pipes. So I think we kind of covered this, but so you're up.
Yeah. So just, we're coming up on the hour, and I know you are super busy, so we try to keep it to that. But how have you seen carrying on that conversation in the tasting room, and you want to hear what people think about it? What do you see as the response to the Vaccarèse in your portfolio? And like, your club members, I would be so geeky. Like if I got that newsletter that said, okay, we have this, I would be like, yes, are you getting that? What?
Add to cart.
One of the most fun things that we get to do is kind of debut and dive into these new grapes. So it's one of the things I know that our club members really look forward to. It's like, okay, you've been hearing about us as we brought this grape in. We've been telling you how it grows. We've been telling you what it's like to make wine out of it. Finally, it's ready. So that's a really fun thing. And I think people who come to Tablas Creek come at least in part because it's a place where they can discover a bunch of things that they probably haven't had anywhere else. So, I mean, it's not everybody. It's not just the guy who stopped in down the street and was like, where else should I go? It's like, oh, you should go to Tablas. They make nice wines. Like, not necessarily that consumer, but yeah, the people who are on our mailing list, people who are in our wine club, who will often come out to Tablas and be like, yeah, I know this. Here's the list of what you're pouring, but really, like, what's the cool new stuff that you've got? Yeah, you're one of those. Like, we'll put together that list. So.
There you go.
Somebody that's not looking for the everyday stuff.
Well, if they were really looking for everyday stuff, they probably wouldn't have landed at Tablas Creek anyway. But yes.
Okay. And then do you see, again, you are the frontier man for many of these grapes, but do you see this as becoming Vaccarèse as becoming a popular grape variety? That, I mean, you have the nursery, so you sell the root stocks and all of that stuff. Do you see this as being a potentially Cinderella story of grapes?
It's a really good question. I don't know that I have a great answer to it. I do not think that this is the kind of grape that people are particularly looking to plant right now. It seems like the interest that we're seeing is more in whites than it is in reds. We're seeing a lot of, and I think that that's true if you look across the United States. There's a pretty profound shift away from like richer red wines towards fresher reds and whites. And you can see this in the sales data. We see it in like the percentage of people who sign up for the white wine only version of our wine club. And you can see it even in the planting data. If you look at the grapes that are being planted, you see things like Pickpool and Vermentino and these like higher acid white varieties that are going in the ground at a pretty good rate. So I don't know if this black fruited kind of herby, spicy red grape is really what the American market is looking to discover right now. But I think it's something which is super cool and appealing. I think it's certainly something that will have an appealing niche in that world of kind of Rhône Rangers, Rhône wine lovers.
Perfect. Well, I love it.
I can't wait to try it.
I love it.
Yeah, we've been teasing you with this for an hour now.
I know. I might get in the car today and drive 3.5 hours and go get it.
Can you please just tell people how they can find Tablas Creek? I will say that I do send lots and lots of people over to you because for the people, I was like, oh, you want to geek out on some grapes? Here you go. But how can people find Tablas Creek? How can they get your wine? How can they follow you on the socials? All of that good stuff.
So we are tablascreek.com is our website, which is it's a pretty in-depth, detailed website. If you want information on all of these grape varieties, you want their history, you want food pairings, you want recipes, you want all of that. That's all there. On all of the socials, we're at Tablas Creek, and we try to really be wherever our audience is. So whether that is Instagram or Facebook or Threads or Twitter or YouTube, like you can find us at Tablas Creek on all of those. I am at Jason C. Haas on Instagram. I don't do a ton of work-related stuff on socials, but I do on like LinkedIn and Threads and Blue Sky. So you can find me that way. And then beyond that, in terms of getting our wines, we do have distribution, at least in a small way, around the country. We have a little widget on our website that it's called Find Our Wine. So if you are in a particular spot and you want to know if there's a restaurant or a wine shop near you that has our wines, you can just plug in where you are into that. And then we can ship to 43 states. Sorry, sadly, not New Jersey yet. But we can ship to 43 states. So if there's things like this Vaccarèse that you want, it's not in distribution, then just reach out to us and get it from us.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
And I should probably give a little plug to our blog also, that which you can find.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Linked off of our homepage, and then tablascreek.typepad.com if you want to go there direct.
And you'll learn a wealth of information.
Yes.
We just passed our 1,000th post on the blog.
Wow.
Awesome. That is wonderful.
Okay. It really is an incredible, I love reading it all the time. It's just a wealth of information. Your website is a wealth of information. There's lots of times that I'll be doing research for something I'm writing and I'll Google something and it's bringing me to you, so.
I just, before we go, I just want to put in, Georgie wrote, thank you. This is new to me, a new variety. And as a French scholar, wine nerd, I'm very excited to try it.
Well,
awesome.
You now know where to get it.
Yes. And Georgie, tell us what you think of it once, you get a bottle of it and try it.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you so much, Jason. Thank you for taking your time and for sharing your wine. I did Coravin it because if I opened it, I was afraid that it would be gone before my husband came home. But I did save a little just to say slancha and thank you very much.
And thanks for starting your week with us.
Thank you both.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you, Jason.